Daniel Harris stood in front of the foggy bathroom mirror in his cramped Brooklyn apartment, fumbling with the frayed tie that was the last relic of his old life. Outside, the New York night bit with a late March chill, the distant wail of sirens seeping through the thin walls like a restless soundtrack. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold seeping through his borrowed jacket, but because tonight he'd walk into a Manhattan gala where the people who'd mocked him would finally face the truth. 2 years ago, he was the golden boy of the city's elite, heir to the billion-dollar Harris real estate empire. Now, he was an outcast, but no one saw what was coming. They'd laughed in his face when he married her, Amara Jackson, a woman who didn't belong in his world. "You've lost it, Dan," his buddy Jake had sneered over a pool table at the Westchester Golf Club, smirking like Daniel had just bet his fortune on a Vegas slot machine. Marrying some girl from Harlem? What's next? Starring in a romantic comedy? His parents were worse. They called it a disgrace to the family, as if he'd torched a century of Harris legacy with a single wedding band. But tonight, in the very place they'd once sneered at him, they'd choke on every word they'd thrown his way, and the cost would hit harder than they'd ever imagined. Daniel stared into the mirror, his tired eyes framed by dark circles deeper than ever. His hair was a mess, his face unshaven, a far cry from the polished prince he'd once been. The last 2 years had been a war, losing the penthouse, the money, the friends who'd once slapped his back at galas. But he wasn't alone. Amara, with her fierce eyes and a smile tough as steel, had stood by him through it all. She wasn't some dreamer or pushover. She'd grown up in Harlem, taught herself design from borrowed books, clawed her way up from days when dinner was a luxury. He'd met her at a cheap art exhibit in Soho, where she stood out like a flame among the fake smiles, talking about sustainable art with a passion he'd never seen. Right then, he knew she'd upend everything, though he didn't dare admit it at the time. He took a deep breath, the air shaky in the cold room. Tonight wasn't just a gala, it was a victory, an answer to the sneers, the whispers behind his back. He clenched his fists, staring at his reflection. "You've got this," he muttered to himself. And for the first time in 2 years he believed it. Daniel Harris couldn't pinpoint the exact moment Amara Jackson crashed into his life, but he'd never forget the first time he really saw her. It was a damp Thursday night in Soho, at an art gallery opening his father, Richard Harris, had strong-armed him into attending. "Rub elbows with the right people," Richard had barked over the phone. So there Daniel was, in a tailored suit that felt more like a straitjacket, nursing a lukewarm gin and tonic among a crowd of pretentious suits pretending to care about abstract sculptures. Then he heard her, Amara, standing by a rough sketch of a modular home made from salvaged steel and wood, her voice slicing through the hum of small talk. "Beauty doesn't have to cost the earth," she said, her hands gesturing with a fire he couldn't ignore. "It's about building smart, not just building big." She wasn't polished or rehearsed, just real, with her tight curls pulled back, and a spark in her brown eyes that made him forget the room. They didn't talk that night. He didn't have the guts, but fate gave him a second shot 2 weeks later at a dive bar in the East Village. He ducked in to escape a brutal day of meetings, his tie loosened, his mind a mess. She was there, alone at the bar, scribbling in a worn notebook between sips of cheap beer. "You again," she said, glancing up with a half-smile like she'd been expecting him. He slid onto the stool next to her, fumbling for words. "That sketch you talked about, back at the gallery, it stuck with me," he managed. She raised an eyebrow, then slid the notebook over. It was full of designs, practical, ingenious, alive. They talked until the bartender kicked them out, about her dreams of sustainable design, his suffocating life in the Harris machine. When she laughed at his awkward attempt at a joke, something in him cracked open. That night, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse, he thought, "She's trouble. The kind I might not walk away from." Their bond grew fast and messy. Secret meetups at hole-in-the-wall diners, late-night walks across the Brooklyn Bridge where she'd tease him about his overpriced shoes. But when he brought her name up to his family, it was like dropping a match in a room full of gasoline. He stood in Richard's office on the 40th floor of the Harris Tower, the Manhattan skyline glinting through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "I'm going to marry her," Daniel said, his voice steadier than he felt. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, his face a mask of ice. "Her? That girl from the projects?" he said, each word a blade. "No degree, no name, no nothing? You're flushing your future down the drain for some fling." His mother, Margaret, paced by the window, her heels clicking like a metronome. "Daniel, please," she begged, voice breaking. "We raised you for better than this. You owe us. You owe the Harris legacy. A match that strengthens us, not tears us apart." It wasn't just Amara's race that burned them. It was her roots, her lack of a trust fund or a fancy last name. She didn't fit the script. Daniel pushed back, his throat tight. "She's not a fling. She's—" Richard cut him off, slamming a hand on the desk. "She's a mistake. You think this is a fairy tale? Wake up, son. In this world, you need power, connections, not some starry-eyed nobody." Daniel stared at his father, the man who'd clawed his way to the top of New York real estate, who'd never bent for anyone. But beneath the steel, Daniel saw something flicker, panic. Richard wasn't worried about losing him. He was terrified of losing control. The fallout didn't stop at home. His friends piled on with a venom that stung deeper than he'd expected. At a rooftop bar in Tribeca, over whiskey and cigars, they let loose. "You're kidding, right, Dan?" Mike, a Wall Street broker he'd known since prep school, chuckled into his glass. "Marrying her? What's next? Moving into a tenement and playing house? She's not one of us. Never will be." The laughter spread around the table, sharp and cutting. Word raced through the city's elite, from penthouse brunches to private clubs. "Daniel Harris, slumming it with a charity case," they sneered, like he was some washed-up reality star. It wasn't just gossip. It was a public execution of his old life. The final showdown came on a Sunday afternoon, back in Richard's office. Daniel had spent the night before with Amara at her tiny Harlem walk-up, eating takeout on her sagging couch, her laughter filling the cracked walls. It was the freest he'd ever felt. Now, standing across from his father, he faced the ultimatum. "You walk out that door with her, and you're done," Richard said, his voice flat, final. "No money, no company, no family. You'll regret it, and I won't be there to pick up the pieces." The air was thick, the hum of the city muted beyond the glass. Daniel glanced at his mother, her eyes red but silent, then at the framed photo on the desk, him as a kid, smiling between them, a puppet in their perfect play. He thought of Amara, her hands smudged with charcoal, the way she looked at him like he was more than a last name, the quiet strength she carried like a shield. His chest tightened, but his resolve hardened. "I don't need your world," he said, meeting Richard's gaze. "I'll build my own." He turned, walked out, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. He chose her, not out of blind passion, but because he knew a life tethered to their rules wasn't living at all. They thought he'd crash and burn. They had no clue what he'd ignite instead. Daniel walked out of his father's office with nothing but the clothes on his back and a buzzing in his ears, the echo of that slammed door still ringing. He'd made his choice. Amara over the Harris empire, and the weight of it hit him like a freight train as he stepped onto the bustling Manhattan street. The city didn't care. Taxis honked, suits brushed past, the skyline loomed indifferent. He'd just torched every safety net he'd ever known, and for a split second, he wondered if Mike and the rest were right. Maybe he was crazy. But then he thought of Amara waiting for him at that dive bar in the East Village, her steady gaze cutting through his doubt, and his steps quickened. This wasn't the end. It was a start. He just didn't know how brutal that start would be. The fallout came fast and hard. Within 48 hours, his phone lit up with a curt text from Margaret. "Your accounts are frozen. The penthouse lease is terminated. Good luck." No love, no mom, just cold efficiency. He stood in the plush living room of his Upper East Side apartment, staring at the view he'd taken for granted, Central Park sprawling under a gray sky, and realized it wasn't his anymore. By noon, movers arrived, their boots scuffing the hardwood as they boxed up his life under Richard's orders. Daniel grabbed a duffel bag, stuffed it with a few shirts, his laptop and that frayed tie from the gala, then walked out. He didn't look back. Amara met him on the corner of 79th and Lexington, her arms crossed against the wind. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. He nodded, though the knot in his gut said otherwise. "We'll figure it out," she said, and her hand slipped into his, grounding him. They landed in a shoebox apartment in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, a fourth-floor walk-up with peeling paint and a radiator that clanked like a dying engine. The first night, Daniel lay on a mattress they'd hauled off Craigslist, listening to the screech of a bodega shutter outside, Amara's breathing steady beside him. It was a far cry from the penthouse's silence, but her warmth next to him made it bearable. The next morning, reality sank in. No trust fund, no cushy job at Harris Realty, no network of old money pals to lean on. His inbox, once flooded with invites to Hampton's brunches and Wall Street mixers, was a ghost town. A call to Jake went straight to voicemail. A text to Mike got a reply 3 days later. "Told you, man. Hope it's worth it." The world he'd ruled had erased him overnight. Survival mode kicked in quick. Daniel pounded the pavement for work, but his Ivy League degree and Harris surname, once golden tickets, were now liabilities. "You're Richard's kid, right?" a hiring manager at a midtown firm asked, eyebrows raised. "Heard you're out. Sorry, man, we can't touch that drama." Doors slammed shut one after another. He swallowed his pride and took a gig unloading delivery trucks in Red Hook, his hands blistering from crates of frozen fish, his back screaming by day's end. Amara didn't sit idle either. She hawked her sketches on Etsy, turning coffee-stained napkins into designs for eco-friendly coasters and wall art. They scraped by on pennies, splitting bodega sandwiches and counting quarters for the laundromat. "We've got this," she'd say, her voice a lifeline when he felt like he was drowning. But late at night, staring at the water-stained ceiling, he'd whisper to himself, "Am I enough for her? Or am I dragging her down?" Weeks bled into months, and the grind wore him thin. His hands, once soft from boardroom handshakes, were calloused and cracked. He'd catch glimpses of his old life, suits in chauffeured cars, glittering marquees for events he'd once headlined, and the sting was sharp. One rainy afternoon, trudging home from a double shift, he passed a cafe on Fulton Street where a former colleague sat sipping espresso. "Dan?" the guy called out, pity dripping from his tone. "Man, what happened to you?" Daniel forced a smile, muttered something about new beginnings, and kept walking, the words burning in his chest. The whispers never stopped. On the subway, in delis, strangers who recognized the fallen prince. That's him, the Harris kid who threw it all away. He tuned them out, but the doubt gnawed louder. Did I make the right call? Amara saw it. The slump in his shoulders, the way he'd stare at nothing after a long day. She didn't push, didn't pry, just kept going. One night, She came home late from a freelance gig, her coat damp from the drizzle, and found him hunched over a stack of unpaid bills on their wobbly kitchen table. "Hey," she said, dropping her bag and sliding into the chair across from him. "Rough day?" He shrugged, avoiding her eyes. "I'm fine." She reached over, her fingers brushing his. "You don't have to be fine all the time, Dan. But we're in this together, okay?" Her voice was quiet, steady, and it cracked something open in him. He looked at her, really looked, and saw the woman who'd chosen him when everyone else walked away. "I don't want you carrying this alone," he said, voice rough. She smiled, small but real. "Then don't." That moment shifted something. The next evening, they sat on that same creaky table, a single bulb flickering overhead. Amara was sketching, her pencil scratching out a design for a recycled wood bookshelf, lost in her own world. Daniel watched her, the way her brow furrowed when she hit a snag, the way she didn't quit. An idea sparked, faint at first, then blazing. "What if we stop surviving and start building?" he said, the words tumbling out. She looked up, curious. "Building what?" He leaned forward, hands restless. "A business. Your designs, my know-how. Something real, sustainable, like you're always talking about." She set her pencil down, eyes searching his. "You mean it?" He nodded, adrenaline kicking in. "We've got nothing left to lose." They didn't sleep that night. By morning, they'd scribbled a plan on the back of an old flyer, Nova Designs, a company blending her eco-friendly vision with his business chops. They pooled their last $200, her Etsy cash, his delivery tips, for a domain name and a stack of cheap business cards. The first pitch went to a bodega owner on Nostrand Avenue who'd liked Amara's coasters. He laughed them out the door. So did the next guy, and the next. Rejection piled up like the bills they couldn't pay, but Amara's fire kept them going. "They'll see it eventually," she'd say, her jaw set. Daniel clung to that, her belief, her grit, because deep down he wasn't sure he had enough of his own. It was a long shot, a desperate swing in the dark. The city didn't give a damn about two broke dreamers in a crumbling apartment, and the odds were stacked high. But as Daniel watched Amara sketch under that dim light, he felt something he hadn't in months: hope. They were down, battered, but not out. Not yet. And that was enough to keep fighting. Daniel woke to the clatter of Brooklyn waking up, delivery trucks rumbling, a car alarm wailing somewhere down the block. The mattress sagged beneath him, the springs groaning as he rolled over to see Amara already up, hunched over their rickety kitchen table. She was sketching again, her pencil flying across a crumpled sheet of graph paper, turning yesterday's bodega receipt into a blueprint for something new. Nova Designs was still just a name, a flicker of hope scribbled on a flyer, but her focus made it feel real. After months of scraping by, him hauling crates in Red Hook, her hustling Etsy sales, they'd taken the leap. That first pitch to the bodega owner had flopped hard, his laugh still echoing in Daniel's ears. "You think I've got cash for fancy shelves?" But Amara hadn't flinched. "Next one," she'd said, brushing it off. Her grit was contagious, and it was the only thing keeping him from folding. Their break came 2 weeks later, small but real. Amara had sold a set of coasters to a barista at a tiny coffee shop on DeKalb Avenue, a hole in the wall called Brew and Branch. The owner, a wiry guy named Leo with a beard down to his chest, liked her vibe and asked about a redesign, something eco-friendly to match his green branding. Daniel tagged along to the meeting, his tie swapped for a faded hoodie, nerves jangling. Amara spread her sketches across a sticky table, reclaimed wood counters, planters from old barrels, a vibe that screamed Brooklyn cool without breaking the bank. "It's not just pretty," she said, her voice steady. "It's smart, low waste, high impact." Leo scratched his chin, skeptical. "And you?" he asked Daniel, sizing him up. I make sure it happens, Daniel replied, channeling every boardroom trick he'd learned. We source cheap, build fast, and you get buzz. Instagram's gonna eat this up. Leo nodded, slow at first, then firm. All right, let's do it. They threw everything into that job. Daniel scoured salvage yards in Bushwick for materials, haggling with grizzled vendors until his throat was raw. Amara worked nights, tweaking designs by the light of a flickering lamp, her hands smudged with graphite. They had no crew, no budget, just $300 from Leo's deposit and a deadline that loomed like a guillotine. The first day on site, Daniel nearly dropped a plank on his foot. Amara laughed so hard she had to sit down. But by week's end, Brew and Branch reopened with a new look, rustic, warm, undeniably theirs. Customers snapped photos, hashtags spread, and Leo grinned like he'd won the lottery. You two are all right, he said, slipping them an extra $50. It wasn't much, but it was a win, a crack of light in the dark. Word trickled out slow at first. A vegan bakery in Williamsburg called next, then a yoga studio in Greenpoint. Small gigs, but each one built on the last. Nova Designs wasn't a pipe dream anymore. It was a hustle with a pulse. Daniel quit the delivery gig, his hands finally healing, and Amara scaled back on Etsy to focus. They reinvested every dime. Business cards turned into a bare-bones website, then a used printer for mock-ups. But growth brought scrutiny. One afternoon, pitching to a boutique owner in Dumbo, the guy leaned back and smirked. Harris, huh? You're that Harris kid, the one who tanked his trust fund for a girl. What's this, some rich boy hobby? Daniel's jaw tightened, but he kept his cool. It's a business, he said, sliding a portfolio across the table. Judge it on that. The guy shrugged, unimpressed, and passed. It wasn't the first time his name dragged him down, and it wouldn't be the last. The doubters got louder as Nova climbed. At a networking event in a Williamsburg loft, cheap beer, hipsters in flannel, Daniel overheard an old college buddy, Ethan, holding court. Dan thinks he's Elon Musk now, Ethan snorted, swirling his IPA. Building some eco-crap with his wife. Please, he's just playing startup till daddy bails him out. The room chuckled, and Daniel, nursing a seltzer in the corner, felt the heat rise in his chest. He wanted to storm over, shove the truth in their faces. Richard hadn't sent a dime, hadn't even sent a word, but he stayed put. Amara caught his eye from across the room, her look saying, "Let it go." She was right. Their work would shut them up eventually. But the sting lingered, a splinter he couldn't pull out. The real test came 6 months in when a mid-sized real estate firm in Midtown reached out. A $20,000 contract to redesign their lobby with sustainable flair. It was their shot at the big leagues, but it came with a catch. The firm wanted fast turnarounds and a glossy finish, pushing the edge of Nova's eco-ethos. Daniel saw dollar signs, rent paid, a real office, breathing room. Amara saw compromise. They hashed it out one night in their apartment, the table littered with takeout cartons and blueprints. This could put us on the map, Daniel argued, pacing the tiny kitchen. We can't stay small forever. Amara crossed her arms, her voice sharp. And what? Build some shiny garbage that's green in name only? That's not us, Dan. We don't sell out. He snapped, frustration boiling over. Maybe I'm tired of scraping by. Maybe I'm not good enough to keep this pure and still keep us afloat. The room went quiet, the clank of the radiator filling the void. Amara didn't flinch, just watched him, her eyes steady. Then she stepped closer, her hand resting on his arm. You're enough when you're you, she said, soft but firm. Not some suit chasing cash. You're better than that. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a raw ache. He sank into a chair, running a hand through his hair. I just don't want to fail you, he muttered. She knelt beside him, her fingers lacing through his. You won't. But we do this right, or we don't do it at all. They turned down the gig the next day, a gut punch to their bank account, but a lifeline to their soul. It was the moment Daniel realized Nova wasn't just a business. It was who they were. The grind didn't let up. Rejection still outnumbered wins, and bills stacked higher than their salvaged wood scraps. Daniel's old life haunted him, glimpses of it in glossy ads for Harris Realty, in the pitying stares of ex-friends he'd dodge on the subway. One evening, riding the L train home, he caught his reflection in the grimy window, worn jacket, stubbled jaw, a stranger to the guy he'd been. Who am I now? He wondered. The question gnawed at him. Was he building something real, or just riding Amara's coattails? She never let him wallow long. One night, as they sat on their fire escape, the city sprawling below, she handed him a beer and said, "You're overthinking again." He smirked, caught, guilty. She leaned against him, her voice low. "We're not them, Dan. We're us, and that's enough." Their next break came unexpected, a feature in a local design blog, Brooklyn's Eco Warriors, spotlighting Brew and Branch. The post went viral, racking up shares from eco-hipsters and small biz owners alike. Suddenly, their inbox pinged with inquiries, a co-op in Park Slope, a pop-up in Bushwick. They hired their first helper, a scrappy kid named Javi fresh out of Pratt, who'd work for coffee and a byline. Nova Designs was growing, roots digging deeper into the city's concrete. But with every step up, the shadow of Daniel's past loomed larger. At a pitch to a Williamsburg gallery, the owner, a slick guy in a $500 scarf, leaned back and said, "Heard your dad's a big shot. You really cut off? Or is this some trust fund PR stunt?" Daniel's stomach twisted, but he kept his face blank. "It's real," he said, voice clipped. "Check the work." The guy signed on, but the question stuck. Am I proving them wrong or proving them right? They were climbing, no question, each project sharper, each client bigger. But the higher they went, the more the world watched, waiting for the fall. Daniel felt it, the pressure, the eyes, the whispers that never died. He'd glance at Amara, her pencil scratching late into the night, and wonder if they'd built a ladder or a tightrope. Either way, they weren't turning back. Daniel leaned against the chipped counter in their Bed-Stuy apartment, the morning sun slicing through the blinds, casting jagged shadows across the cluttered kitchen. His coffee sat cold in the mug, untouched, as he stared at Javi's mock-ups and Amara's sketches pinned to the wall like a patchwork of their dreams. Nova Designs had fought its way up over the past year, 12 months of sleepless nights, bruised hands, and a slow climb from obscurity to a name people whispered. They'd just locked in a $10,000 deal to redesign a co-working space in Flatbush, their biggest yet, and the buzz was swelling. Indie mags, eco-hipsters, a ripple from that viral Brew and Branch post. But success dragged ghosts along with it. That smug jab at the Williamsburg gallery, "Heard your dad's a big shot," still echoed, a splinter he couldn't pull free. It yanked at a memory, faint but sharp. Years ago, fresh from college, he'd lingered in Richard's office at Harris Tower, the city glittering beyond the glass. Richard had been on the phone, voice clipped. "The Jersey project's handled," he'd barked, slamming the receiver down, his jaw tight. Daniel had shrugged it off. Richard was untouchable, his empire unshakable. Now it clawed at him, a thread unraveling in the back of his mind. He shook it off, blaming exhaustion, and grabbed his jacket to join Amara at the Flatbush site. She was already there, bandana taming her curls, guiding Javi on a reclaimed wood partition. "Looks good, huh?" she called, her grin bright against the dust. He nodded, forcing a smile. "Real good." But as he hauled a crate of salvaged steel, that call scratched louder. Jersey, tension, a buried edge. The truth crashed in 2 weeks later, a sucker punch from a clear sky. Daniel slouched on the L train, scrolling X after a 14-hour grind, when a headline jolted him upright. Harris Realty linked to decades-old Hudson River scandal. Carla Ruiz, a relentless reporter, had unearthed a horror show. In the 90s, Richard funded a luxury condo project on the Jersey Shore, cutting corners with a crooked contractor who dumped toxic waste into the Hudson. Fish died in clumps, kids got sick, cleanup costs soared. But Richard buried it with bribes, forged permits, and a slick PR mask. Ruiz had it all: docs, photos, a whistleblower's voice on tape. The story detonated. Post front page, X erupting, a wrecking ball to the Harris name. Daniel's phone buzzed like a swarm as he stumbled off the train. Texts from old buddies. "You see this? Damn, man." He raced home, Brooklyn's streets a haze, and found Amara on the fire escape, her phone glowing with the news. "This legit?" she asked, voice tight. He nodded, dropping beside her, chest heaving. They scrolled in silence, the city droning below. Images of dead fish choking the river. A memo with Richard's scrawl. A '97 photo of him smirking with the contractor. "Jersey," Daniel muttered, pieces slamming together. "I heard him, years ago, on the phone. Didn't know." Amara's hand gripped his, steadying him. "He hit it," she said, flat. "You didn't." The fallout was a storm. By morning, Harris Realty's stock nosedived. Investors ran. Clients bailed. Richard's kingdom crumbling on live news. Daniel's inbox flooded with reporters, but then Richard's number flashed up. He froze, thumb hovering, Amara's eyes on him. "You'll wonder," she said, soft. He answered, voice clipped. "Yeah?" Richard sounded broken, his steel voice rusted. "Daniel, you've seen it." A pause, then raw. "I need you back. The board's a mess. They'd trust you. Help me fix this." Daniel's breath caught, a floodgate cracking open. Fix it? The man who'd built him up, then tore him down, begging now? Memories hit hard. Summers at the Hamptons' house. Richard hoisting him onto broad shoulders to pluck peaches from a tree, laughing as juice dripped down their chins. Margaret in the kitchen, her apron dusted with flour, teaching him to roll dough for Christmas cookies, her smile warm as the oven. Those days, he'd worshipped them. His invincible dad, his gentle mom. Now, that dad was a liar who'd poisoned a river, that mom a silent accomplice who'd let him go. His chest burned, torn between the kid who'd loved them and the man they'd betrayed. "You poisoned people," he said, voice shaking. "You threw me out when I picked her. Now you want me to clean it up?" Richard's breath rasped. "I messed up. Worse than you know. But you're my son. Please, give me something." Daniel's hands trembled, the phone slick with sweat. He saw Richard's graying face, imagined Margaret's tears, and hated how it still hurt. He wanted to scream, to hang up, to let them sink. But that little boy in him, the one who'd chased their approval, wouldn't let go. Margaret's call came next, her voice a sob. "Daniel, we were wrong. I see it now. We're losing everything. Don't let us fall like this." Her words clawed at him, a flood of her, tucking him in, singing lullabies in that soft voice. He pressed his forehead to the wall, fighting the ache. "I can't fix it," he choked out. "You broke us. Why's it on me?" He stumbled inside, Amara following, her silence heavy. She sat him down at their wobbly table, her hand on his shoulder. "Talk to me," she said, firm but gentle. He buried his face in his hands, voice raw. "They're begging, after everything. I hate them for it. But I see them falling. And it's like I'm 5 again, needing them to catch me. I don't know what to do." She knelt beside him, her eyes fierce but warm. "You don't owe them your life. You've built yours. But if it's tearing you up, give them something small, contacts, a lead. Not for them, for you. To sleep at night." He looked at her, the woman who'd held him through the dark, and the storm in him quieted. "You think that's enough?" She nodded. "It's more than they gave you, and it's all they get." He took a shaky breath and called Richard back. "I'm not coming back," he said, steady now. "I can't save your company, but I'll send some names, guys who might help." "That's it." Richard's voice cracked. "Thank you, son. That's something." Margaret's next call got the same. "I'll pass along contacts. That's where it stops." She whispered, "Bless you, sweetheart," and he hung up, slumping against Amara. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded, drained. "Yeah, needed that." The world flipped by dawn. Nova Designs became a beacon. Daniel, the son who ditched a tainted legacy, thriving clean. Clients who'd ignored them rang. The Flatbush budget doubled. He ignored PR vultures, instead emailing old classmates, clean players in real estate, to nudge Richard a lifeline, not a bailout, just a thread. Amara watched him type, brow raised. "Why?" He leaned back. "For me, not them. Lets me move on." She smiled, faint. "Good enough." The spotlight glared. At a Greenpoint pitch, a tech bro grinned. "Eco thing real, or a dig at your dad?" Daniel stayed cool. "Real. Check the dates." Amara backed him with the portfolio. Nova surged. A hotel in LIC, a nonprofit in Harlem, moving them to Crown Heights, a cramped upgrade with a stove. The work shone, but the twist had shifted the ground. Daniel wasn't just the ex-heir, he'd outrun a lie. Richard's calls faded, one last, "Thanks for the names." And Margaret's note sat unanswered. "We're proud. Call sometime." He'd given them a chance, not a pardon, and it settled the ghosts. Amara caught him staring out the window, rice sizzling. "You don't owe more," she said. He pulled her close. "I know. It's done." The city rolled on. Horns, lights, life. Nova was theirs, born from grit. But the twist had rewritten the story. They weren't just dreamers. They were proof. And as Daniel watched Amara sketch, her pencil tracing their future, he knew the next fight was theirs to win. Together. Daniel stood on the narrow balcony of their new Crown Heights apartment, the city's amber glow sprawling out like a living map beneath him. A brisk October wind sliced through, tugging at his jacket and carrying the faint tang of roasted chestnuts from a street vendor below. The sounds of Brooklyn pulsed up, car horns weaving into laughter from a rooftop bar, a bodega shutter rattling shut down the block. Inside, Amara sprawled across their thrift store couch, a chipped mug of chamomile tea steaming in her hands, her sketchbook splayed open with wild designs for their latest win, a $500,000 contract with a Paris hotel chain to green up lobbies across Europe. 2 years back, they'd been broke and battered in a Bed-Stuy walk-up, counting quarters for the laundromat. Now, Nova Designs was a global name, forged from their sweat and stubbornness. The Hudson River scandal had flipped the board. Richard's empire sank into the muck, and clients who'd once laughed now clamored for the outcasts who'd built something clean. But tonight wasn't about deals or headlines. It was about staring down the past and letting it rest. The invite had landed weeks ago, a thick envelope stamped with the Harris crest in gold wax, a charity gala at the Plaza, Richard's old throne of power. Daniel had eyed it on their cluttered kitchen table, the weight of it dragging him back to that oak office, the cold ultimatums, the exile when he chose Amara. "Chuck it," he'd growled, but Amara slid it back, her gaze steady. They're reaching out, Dan. See what's behind it. He'd wrestled with it. Why give them air after they'd suffocated him? But the contacts he'd sent after the scandal, those quiet emails to old classmates, had tossed his parents a lifeline. Word was they'd scraped a few deals, enough to limp along, and maybe this was their olive branch. So he'd relented, pulling on that frayed tie from their lean days, Amara at his side in a sleek black dress that outshone the room's glitz. They stepped into the plaza's ballroom, chandeliers dripping golden light over a sea of tuxes and sequins, and the air shifted, heads turned, whispers rippled, the old scorn replaced by a cautious hush. Margaret wove through the crowd first, her silver hair pinned tight, her navy gown softer than the rigid couture of old. Her eyes shimmered as she reached him, hands hovering like she wanted to touch him but didn't dare. "Daniel," she said, voice trembling, "you're here." He nodded, keeping it even. "You asked me to come." Her gaze darted to Amara, a fragile smile breaking through. "You look radiant, dear. Truly." Amara returned it, warm but guarded. "Thanks, Margaret." His mother's eyes settled back on him, pleading. "Your father's by the bar. He's been hoping. He's not the man he was." Daniel followed her look. Richard leaned against the polished wood, grayer, thinner, a husk of the titan who'd once owned these rooms. A scattering of old allies lingered nearby, their chatter thin, forced. Daniel took Amara's hand, her fingers steady in his, and crossed the floor, the weight of every step pulling at him. Richard turned as they neared, his eyes locking on Daniel's, clouded with age and strain, but still glinting with that old fire. The room stilled, a dozen suits pretending to sip martinis, ears straining. "Daniel," Richard said, voice rough, a shadow of its old weight. "Didn't think you'd show." Daniel shrugged, keeping it light despite the knot in his gut. "Got your invite. Figured I'd see what's left." Richard studied him, then leaned heavier on the bar like it was propping him up. "You've built something. Nova's everywhere now. We've watched it grow." Daniel caught the shift, the grudging pride laced with a crack of something raw. "Took some doing," he said, neutral. Richard exhaled, his shoulders sagging. "I blew it. Worse than I'll ever admit. The river, the cover-up, it's gutted us. Your mother, she begged me to reach out, said we owed you that." He paused, voice dropping to a near whisper. "Those names you sent, they pulled us back from the edge. Not all the way, but enough. I'm proud, son. Should have said it before you had to prove it." Daniel's chest clenched, a rush of old images flooding in. Richard tossing a baseball in their Hamptons yard, his deep laugh booming as Daniel stumbled to catch it. Margaret braiding daisies into a crown for him at a picnic, her hands gentle against his sunburned cheeks. Those days, they'd been his world, unbreakable, golden. Now, that world was ash, and the man before him was a stranger who'd traded integrity for power, the woman a ghost who'd let him go. The ache twisted, anger at their betrayal, guilt for the kid who still cared. "You didn't need to wait till I won," he said, voice low, steady despite the tremor inside. "I didn't do this for you. Or because of you." Richard nodded, slow, regret flickering in his eyes. "I know, just thank you for the contacts. It's more than I earned." Daniel held his gaze, then gave a tight nod. "Glad it helped. Keep it together." No embrace, no grand promises. Just a quiet bridge, not a road back. They didn't linger. As they threaded out, a few old faces clapped his shoulder, respect now, not sneers, and Daniel felt the shift settle. Outside, the city air washed over them, crisp and clean, the plaza's glow fading into the night. Amara looped her arm through his, her voice breaking the hush. "How's that feel?" He exhaled, a real grin cracking through, lighter than he'd expected, like I shed something heavy. They walked home through Brooklyn's Pulse, kids shooting hoops on a corner court, neon flickering from a nail salon, the clatter of a late-night deli. The gala had been a final tether to cut, not with a blade, but a snip. He'd given his parents a thread, not a lifeline, and it felt right, enough to quiet the ghosts without pulling him back. On the balcony, Daniel leaned against the railing, the skyline jagged against the velvet dark, a canvas of light and shadow they'd claimed. Amara joined him, her tea's steam curling into the breeze, her shoulder brushing his, grounding him like always. "That first night," she said, teasing, "you, me, that creaky mattress, thought we were toast." He laughed, deep and free, the sound bouncing off the bricks. "Yeah, I was sure we'd tank, bills piling up, me hauling fish crates." She grinned, leaning into him, her warmth chasing the chill. "Couldn't have done it without you," he said, voice rough with truth, his arm tightening around her. She nudged him, playful. "Damn right. Someone had to keep you from cracking." The Paris deal was just the start. Nova Designs was global now, their Dumbo office humming with Javi, Lila, and a growing crew, turning out green spaces that breathed. They dodged the post-scandal PR circus, letting the work, clean lines, reclaim materials, speak loud. But standing there, the city sprawling below, Daniel knew it wasn't the contracts or the buzz that defined them. "You know what I figured out?" he said, turning to her, the wind ruffling his hair. "It's not about proving them wrong, or even proving I could. It's about us. What we built from nothing, on our own damn terms." Amara's eyes sparked, her smile fierce and wide. "And doing it together, that's the real trick. Rewrite the rules, win our way." He pulled her close, her laugh vibrating against him, warm and alive. "Best trick we ever pulled." They'd started with zilch, two stubborn souls in a crumbling apartment, spitting in the face of a world that bet they'd fold. Now they stood here, not just survivors but shapers, a legacy not borrowed but carved from their hands. The city gleamed, a testament to their fight, and Daniel felt it, a certainty deeper than the concrete below. "We did it," he said, voice low, final, his arm tight around her. Amara tilted her head against his shoulder, her voice soft but sure. "Yeah, Dan, we did. And we're just getting started." The skyline flickered, theirs to mold, a life earned through grit, love, and a refusal to bow. Whatever came next, more deals, more battles, they'd face it side by side, rules be damned.